Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you very much to Peer for putting this together and for inviting me to come and talk here today. So I think I'm probably the only non-engineer in the room, or maybe there's another one out there somewhere. But I get to work a lot with engineers and with architects over my career, and I really appreciate the interaction that we've had. And a lot of what I've tried to do is bring engineers together with some of these other parts of policy and city government, whether they're finance people or environmental people, sustainability officers, because really we need to be thinking sort of holistically about how we address some of the challenges that we're going to be facing. So very quickly, San Francisco has been dealing with resilience since the great earthquake in 1906. It's not new to us. We've invested in a lot of technology going back to auxiliary water supply systems to help fight fires after the earthquake, that are gravity driven, to now some of the more recent technologies we think about with early earthquake warning and so forth. So San Francisco, while we've been thinking about resilience, it was a sort of new approach. In 2016, we put together this Resilient San Francisco strategy, or Resilient SF strategy, and we identified a number of different challenges that we have as a city to becoming resilient. And we wanted to think not just about big earthquakes, and I'm going to talk a lot about some of the other things. Sometimes I'm referred to as the Chief Calamity Officer, as opposed to the Chief Resilience Officer, because we really are having to think about a lot of different things that are impacting the city. So you have earthquakes, clearly still the top challenge. We have climate change. I'm going to show you some slides around that and how it's impacting us really today. Sea level rise is one of those big impacts that we're having to think about. Infrastructure, we're aging infrastructure, thinking about the fact that our seismic codes change potentially our building codes change every 3 years, and we have major seismic code changes that happen, often once or twice a decade. And then some of the big things, the stressors that I want to talk about are like lack of affordability, certainly the housing issues that are associated with that, and social inequity. We know that a lot of the vulnerable populations are more adversely impacted by disasters than some of the wealthier, more well-to-do populations. And as a result, we really feel that there's a responsibility from an equity perspective to address those challenges. And that is certainly something that's been growing, housing especially, as an issue. So talking about housing, this is a map of San Francisco, and the bright yellow there shows where the population growth is happening. So we're expected to grow by a little bit more than 25 to 30% in the next 15 to 20 years. Those numbers are actually going to get updated very shortly, and it's probably even going to be more aggressive. So we're going to go from about 850,000 people to about 1.3 million people or so. All that development is happening in this sort of yellow area. That's where the planned commercial areas are. That's where the density is happening. We talk about tall buildings. We are going to be, and our mayor was just talking about it the other day, accepting more density as part of the future. We think from a societal perspective, from an environmental perspective, tall buildings, from an elderly, we have larger elderly populations, tall buildings are becoming more and more important to us. And you can also see some of these, some of our HOPE SF, some of our affordable housing projects are also on this side, though there is really affordable housing throughout San Francisco. So this shows the seismic liquefaction zones, and I don't have to tell anyone the importance of liquefaction here. But again, you can see the overlap where the liquefaction zones are and where we're doing all of our building and development. So this poses a certain number of challenges to how we think about our infrastructure, how we think about new infrastructure, but also the existing infrastructure that's there. And then if you think about the vulnerable communities that I mentioned, the darker the color, the more vulnerable the communities are. This came from our Department of Public Health that looked at about 28 different indicators. But you can really see, again, in those same areas where we have the liquefaction, where we used to have a lot of industrial uses, and we still have industrial uses in those areas, that's also where we have the most challenges, the most vulnerable populations. So how can we make sure we do development that addresses these populations but also allows us to be more seismically safe and to provide infrastructure that's befitting, a modern city. So another challenge that we're facing is sea level rise. This has certainly been in the news quite a bit. This report we did actually back in 2016 as well, and we looked at some of the impacts. So when you start to think about the different numbers and the technology that we need to understand sea level rise impacts, and Susan's talk about using some of the radar technology is interesting to us. We know currently today, this is a picture of existing waterfront, but if you look at the high scenario, which is no longer the high scenario, by the way, Ocean Protection Council recently put out numbers that are even higher than this. This is what happens to the bayfront in San Francisco. You can see the Barton Muni Tunnel, which bring over 500,000 people every day into the city, which also move people from some of the more less advantaged parts of the city, the eastern side, into where the jobs are. You can see the impacts of flooding. And then by 2100, you can see that pretty much the entire downtown, we actually go back to First Street. First Street was called First Street because it originally was the first street before the water. If you know San Francisco, it's quite a bit inland now, but this is what we're looking at potentially in 2100 if we aren't reducing greenhouse gases, if we aren't taking steps to either raise the seawall or to do other mitigation measures. Same thing about inland flooding. I should mention this map shows some of the natural waterways that we've had, historic waterways in San Francisco where we had wetland areas and so forth. And now we're seeing a lot of more extreme flooding, and a lot of that is coming from again, climate change, where extreme precipitation, we're studying extreme precipitation right now with Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory actually to get a better idea of what to expect with future storms. But this shows actually our own self-imposed 100-year flood map that we're doing. FEMA is also going to be doing a flood map in some parts of San Francisco, but they tend to be coastal-oriented flooding. This is the inland flooding that we're seeing in San Francisco. And again, we're sort of moving forward with our own measures so that we can start to inform people and make better land use decisions. Other challenges that we're facing, a few years ago when we did our Resilient San Francisco study, we never thought about heat really in any particular way. But in 2017, we had 6 or 7 days of 105 degree plus weather in San Francisco. We had a number of people that passed away as a result of that. Again, if you look at this sort of map where you show the heat, it's also in some of the more vulnerable parts of San Francisco, including Chinatown, the Tenderloin, Hunters Point Shipyard, Bayview, and those areas. We also had 14 or 15 days of bad air quality, and again, this shows that we can no longer think from one city's perspective. You have to think regionally, and you can sort of, I think most people who were here experienced the poor air quality in 2017 where we had to shut down schools. And then we have, some of our new infrastructure, like our new hospital, that's an essential facility, but next to our old buildings that are historic that we haven't figured out how we're going to retrofit them. And as we talk about our tall building study, you'll see that, certainly the buildings that surround your building are just as important as the building itself. Finally, I just want to mention we've also made a lot of progress, as far as having to do with pedestrian safety, our new public safety building, and the opportunities that some of these changes, the earthquakes or these things provide to us. You can see the seawall on the old Embarcadero Freeway, and again, it took us some time because in San Francisco we like to do things, very thoroughly with a lot of public input and everything. But 10 years later, we do have a waterfront that's really remarkable. Now we're trying to protect the waterfront from the water. So no longer from the cars and the bridges or the cars and the freeways. So Greg mentioned we just completed this Hazards and Climate Resilience Plan. We're one of the first, Berkeley did one as well, I think a year ago or so, but we're one of the first ones to get out of the gate which is a plan that follows FEMA regulations. Every 5 years you have to do a hazard mitigation plan, but it's also a plan that's incorporating climate. So for the first time, it's hard to believe, but for the first time, cities are now required in California, not in other parts of the country, to consider climate as a hazard. So we completed this comprehensive plan. It's I don't want to tell you how long it is, but it's quite long. It's like 800 pages. And we looked at sort of these 13 different types of hazards that are facing the city, and then compared them against our various asset classes. So geological, certainly the landslides, tsunamis, earthquakes, those are still some of the biggest things we're concerned with, but now the weather, the extreme drought and those things. Combustion-oriented, we've done a lot of work to sort of understand fire after earthquake. I know you're going to hear from Dr. Scawthorne tomorrow, I think, to talk about some of the risks, but certainly a big concern for us. And then some of the biologic and toxic issues around pandemic flus, but also hazardous soil and what happens with the hazards underneath the soil that we've covered up from radiation and so forth after an earthquake or after a flood. Or after we're seeing groundwater rising as well. We're seeing the groundwater tables going up. And how is that impacting some of these issues? So the other important thing to mention about this report is that we're looking at equity, we're looking at populations. We're now treating populations and vulnerable populations as an asset, as a critical asset to the city, just like we would a bridge or a physical asset. This sort of shows a little bit how we're thinking about the Hazard and Climate Resilience Plan. It's about resilient infrastructure, thinking about the horizontal infrastructure, resilient buildings, and then resilient communities. I want to emphasize that resilient communities, working with people. I think this gets to the shake alert stuff that Richard was talking about, the technology that we need so the communities, they want to know what's going to happen to them. They want to know how they can be prepared. They want to know what they need to do. And we've not always been very good at doing that. There's been a sense that government will take care of you. We need to start to sort of dispel that myth. And finally, on the other axis there, it just sort of shows how government affects, how we can affect policy or how we can affect change. And I think that's important for academics to think about, for people in business to think about, for technology to think about. We have some of these levers around, we own assets, so some of what we do is just leading by example. We deliver community services that are critical. That's certainly a core of our function. We do a lot of research planning and guidance where we just put out information. We try to work with people to do research. And then we adopt and enforce regulations. Certainly building codes, zoning codes, those are important. And finally, the plan itself has 95 different strategies. This is an example of one strategy. We're just retrofitting municipal buildings where we can look at the different hazards it's facing. We're looking at identifying the partners. And the idea is every year we're going to be updating or reporting on these strategies. But this is also part of the requirement for FEMA to do this. So for the first time, we're going to have sort of all of the strategies around hazards for a city and a county. Has around 30, I think we have around 38,000 employees, all in one place. We also have our 10-year capital plan that Greg mentioned. We're actually up to over $4 billion in GEO bonds that have been passed since 2008. Some of the principles here, are making sure that we address mandates, but now we're also thinking about life safety and resilience together. It can't just be life safety. It can no longer be just getting people out of the buildings alive. Now it has to be, how do we get people back in? We saw after the hurricane in New Orleans, Katrina, sort of the social justice impacts were just as big as the immediate impacts that happened after the event. In fact, I think in the earthquake in Puerto Rico, the number of deaths after the earthquake were greater than the number of deaths that happened during the earthquake. So how are we responding? How are we making sure that we have facilities that can be open and that are performance, based on performance goals and objectives that we need? Ensuring, sustainability, important as well. We are relying on some of this old, and I say old though, I think this is a tool that we use in San Francisco. We've done it for a lot of our critical 240 of our sort of general fund department buildings. And we've used this information to look at various scenarios and then to sort of prioritize how we're going to do infrastructure, which infrastructure we're going to fix and to what level we should do that. Really important as a communications tool, and what is good about HAZUS is we have a lot of confidence in it. We get approached by a lot of people with a lot of new technology. Sometimes we call it kind of the black box, and being able to decipher what happens in the black box when you bring in a lot of different data or run Monte Carlo solutions or those things. This is stuff that we want to try to understand, but it needs to be done in a way that we can build confidence, and that means decision makers and the general public, they don't have to understand all the details of it, but they have to have confidence that it's been peer reviewed, that it's well understood. And I have to say, I even have low cost in there too. It has to be something that's affordable and that can be done fairly quickly. This kind of shows our 10-year capital plan. I'll try to speed up through this. But again, we're only issuing new bonds as we retire old ones. California is one of the, in California, as most of you probably know, we have to have 67% of the voters to support a bond. Most all of our bonds are going to seismic safety, I have to tell you. From our seawall to our earthquake safety and emergency response program for fire stations and fire facility and police facilities, to our transportation network as well, where we're doing a lot of seismic improvements. So confidence that people are willing to support the bonds, that we're able to spend the money, that we're going to get the results that we wanted, is really important. This kind of shows sort of what we did around sea level rise. In 2014, we actually came up with a plan to address the city's infrastructure. How high should it be? How high should we raise the ground level around sea level rise? We're using this for our own projects that are over $5 million to think about adaptation. The benefit has been that the private sector folks are using it as well. And so now we have the giants that are developing a ballpark saying, hey, we're going to use the same guidance that you have because it's there. And there really isn't any other great information out there. And as a result, they're going to raise the ground level, I think, at Giants Stadium by 4 or 5 feet. At Seawall Lot 337, or where the Giants parking lot is now. Also shows our floating fire station, which is being constructed at Treasure Island, and then it's going to be moved into place. But I think we're the first city, certainly in the country, to have a floating fire station. So it'll be resilient for years to come. This map shows our earthquake safety implementation program. This was a 10-year plus public outreach process to develop a 30-year plan for how San Francisco can address its seismic needs. It includes a number of programs. Actually, the unreinforced masonry program was already happening when it went forward, but the Softstory retrofit program is coming to an end. We did public-private school evaluations, just trying to provide information, which has led to, I think, close to $23 million in investments in private schools just by the Archdiocese in San Francisco. We have a facade program that's moving forward, and we're going to talk a little bit about steel and concrete program coming up. So this is a picture. This is the Softstory program. We ran this over a 7-year period. And so that people had time and opportunity. And I think part of this is this reluctance to, sometimes everyone says we want to do it right away. It has to be a measured approach, but we also have to show progress. We're at 76% compliance when I did this. We're actually at about 79% compliance right now. The final deadline is coming up. Average retrofit cost for these buildings, is 5+ unit buildings, is $78,000. It's been something that's relatively affordable. That'll be a different story when we start talking about concrete retrofits. The tall buildings program, this gets into some of the thinking about performance. Greg Deerline, Dr. Deerline worked with us on this project. I know Ann Halsey has a poster so you can see it that talks about the cordoning issues, and the bottom right shows, again, how those buildings impact their neighborhoods. So one large building, I can't imagine what the cordoning will be for a building that's a mile high, but pretty extreme. But anyway, that's part of what we're thinking about there. It's usually 1.5 times the height of a building. So I guess it'd be 7,000 feet around the building. Anyway, the other thing that's to show on the map in the top right is we're looking at where development is happening. And we went from tall buildings being strictly office to now being residential and mixed use. And that's been a big change in how we think about resilience. And that was a big part of this report, is understanding that now we have people living in these buildings 24/7. It's no longer just during the workday. And you can kind of see the liquefaction zone in the bottom there. That's the darker brown that sort of goes through the areas. And we've been doing this performance-based design for buildings for a little while. When we talk about non-ductile concrete, this is a picture of where all the concrete buildings pre-1980 are located in San Francisco. Again, part of it's in these areas where interestingly enough, after the 1906 earthquake, for some of the downtown areas, we said no more wood frame buildings because they're going to burn, so we required them all to be concrete. and now they're all concrete stiff buildings that are likely to fail. Maybe not all of them, but a certain portion of them. So this is our next big program, is how we're going to address this, and how do you even identify a building that's vulnerable and that's at risk? What kind of tools and technologies do we have that can help us do that? Finally, I just want to mention a couple other areas. Our Lifelines Council, now we're thinking broadly about different service providers. All these different folks from PG&E, Department of Art, Comcast, AT&T, our Public Utilities Commission are providing critical infrastructure that will be important after an earthquake. They all should be part of the early earthquake warning system. But we also need to think about how they interact together, and they tend not to talk to each other very much. I don't know that that's a surprise to anyone. So we've done some work with them about understanding interdependencies, working with Dr. Lori Johnson, who's done a lot of work on this, and on recovery. So now we have we're doing a restoration, or what we call a lifeline restoration project, where all these different actors are telling us, we've been interviewing them through a structured process, actually based on some research from the University of British Columbia, what's the expected amount of disruption, and what are their goals for addressing that disruption? And how are they doing that? And this really gets into the sort of performance. Everyone was sort of expecting for a little while that the Port of San Francisco would be the way they would bring goods into the city, until the port came to us and said, you know what, we all looked at it, and it's going to be about 8 days before the ports are open. And a lot of that's because of the silt that's going to move on the bay, so we have to move the silt. So that, again, changes everyone else's expectations, and power certainly is critical. So thinking about performance, thinking about building performance is one of the big priorities for San Francisco, and how can we use technology to answer some of those questions and really make for a more resilient community overall. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.